The emergency meeting lasted for 30 days. The 12 arbiters argued and debated and asked the mechanism question after question. They learned more about humans than any consensus species had ever learned about another race. And with each new piece of information, their confusion grew deeper. The mechanism showed them human history. It was chaos. Humans built great civilizations and then burned them down. They created beautiful art and then destroyed it in wars. They wrote laws about justice and fairness and then broke those laws whenever it suited them. They invented democracy and then voted for tyrants. They preached peace and then built weapons that could crack worlds. "They are insane," said Arbiter Velethnoon. "Their minds are damaged. This must be a biological defect." The mechanism disagreed. It had studied human brains in great detail. Their minds worked correctly. The neurons fired as they should. The chemicals flowed in proper amounts. There was no defect. "Then why do they behave this way?" Velethnoon demanded. "They choose to," the mechanism replied. This answer made no sense to the arbiters. No species chose to be irrational. Rationality was survival. Rationality was success. Every species in the galaxy had evolved toward greater rationality, because rational species lived longer and spread further. This was the natural order of things, but humans had evolved differently. They had developed large brains that could think in many ways at once. They could be rational when they wanted to be. They could solve complex problems and build advanced technology. But they could also be emotional, impulsive, and completely unpredictable. And here was the strangest part. They could switch between these modes whenever they wanted. A human scientist could spend years carefully testing a theory, following every rule of logic and evidence. Then that same scientist could go home and make a completely irrational decision about their personal life. They knew it was irrational. They did it anyway. And when asked why, they would shrug and say something like, "It felt right." The mechanism showed the arbiters a human concept called faith. Humans believed in things they could not prove. They followed religions that made claims about the universe without any evidence. When scientists proved these claims were false, many humans continued to believe anyway. This was not stupidity. Many of these believers were highly intelligent. They simply chose to believe things that could not be verified. "How can a species function like this?" asked Arbiter Korithvane. "How do they make decisions? How do they plan for the future?" "They guess," the mechanism said. "They call it intuition or instinct or gut feeling. They make decisions based on incomplete information and emotional responses. Sometimes they are correct. Sometimes they are wrong. They accept both outcomes and continue forward." The arbiters found this horrifying. The entire consensus civilization was built on certainty. Every action had a predicted outcome. Every choice was calculated. The idea of guessing was primitive. It was what species did before they developed proper computing technology. But humans had developed computing technology. They had powerful machines that could calculate probabilities. They used these machines for many things. But when it came to important decisions, the big choices that shaped their lives and their civilization, they often ignored the machines and followed their feelings instead. Arbiter Keth Saloon asked the mechanism to explain why this made prediction impossible. The answer was mathematical, but she understood the basic idea. Prediction worked by finding patterns. If you knew how a species behaved in the past, you could calculate how they would behave in the future. This worked because most species were consistent. They followed their nature. Aggressive species stayed aggressive. A peaceful species stayed peaceful. A logical species stayed logical. Humans were not consistent. They contained contradictions. The same human could be generous to one person and cruel to another. The same society could build hospitals and torture chambers. The same civilization could reach for the stars and destroy its own planet. These contradictions were not random. They followed some kind of internal logic that even humans did not fully understand. But this logic was so complex, so dependent on tiny details of context and emotion and history, that predicting it required more information than the universe contained. The mechanism was powerful. It could simulate entire galaxies. But simulating a single human mind with perfect accuracy was beyond its capabilities. There were too many variables, too many possible states, too many contradictions that somehow coexisted without canceling each other out. "What about groups?" asked Keth Saloon. "Individual humans may be unpredictable, but surely when they gather in large numbers, patterns must emerge." The mechanism had tried this approach. It had studied human crowds, human societies, human civilizations. The results were even worse. When humans gathered in groups, they did not become more predictable. They became less predictable. They influenced each other in ways that multiplied the chaos. Ideas spread through human populations like fire through dry grass, changing direction without warning, dying down and then exploding back to life. Human history was full of moments where everything changed because one person said the right words at the right time. A single speech could start a revolution. A single book could transform a society. A single idea, spreading from mind to mind, could reshape the entire species. And these moments could not be predicted. The mechanism had studied thousands of human turning points. In almost every case, the change had come from somewhere unexpected. The great leaders were often obscure figures until the moment they became great. The revolutionary ideas often seemed unimportant until suddenly they weren't. The arbiters spent days absorbing this information. Some of them refused to accept it. There had to be a pattern. There was always a pattern. The mechanism was simply not looking hard enough. But Keth Saloon was beginning to understand something that frightened her more than anything else. The mechanism was not failing. It was reporting accurately. Humans were genuinely unpredictable, and unpredictable things could not be controlled. For 11 million years, the consensus had controlled the galaxy by controlling the future. They knew what would happen, so they could shape what would happen. They were gardeners tending the garden of civilization, pruning species that grew in dangerous directions, cultivating species that grew in useful ones. But you could not garden what you could not see. You could not prune what you could not predict. Humans were a weed that grew in directions no one could anticipate, and the consensus had no tools to deal with them. The meeting ended without a decision. For the first time in 400,000 years, the arbiters did not know what to do. Some wanted to destroy humanity immediately, before they spread further. Others wanted to ignore them and hope they destroyed themselves, as chaotic species often did. A few suggested making contact, but no one could agree on what to say. Keth Saloon proposed something different. She would go to the human world herself. She would observe them directly. Perhaps there was something the mechanism had missed, some pattern that could only be seen up close. The other arbiters agreed. It was a small hope, but it was all they had. Keth Saloon prepared her ship and set course for the small blue world. She did not know what she would find there. For the first time in 3,000 years, she was acting without a prediction to guide her. She found that she did not entirely hate the feeling. The Varathani consensus had ruled the galaxy for 11 million years. They had done this with one tool. It was not a weapon. It was not a fleet of warships. It was a machine called the likelihood mechanism. The mechanism was the size of a small moon. It floated in the empty space between stars, protected by shields that could stop anything. Inside its crystal shell, quantum processors worked without rest. They calculated probability. They predicted the future for 11 million years. The consensus had never made a single decision without asking the mechanism first. Should they start a war? The mechanism would calculate who would win. Should they build a colony on a distant world? The mechanism would tell them if the colony would succeed or fail. Should they make contact with a new alien species? The mechanism would show them every possible outcome of that meeting. The system worked perfectly. The consensus won every war because they only fought wars they knew they would win. Their colonies always prospered because they only built colonies in places the mechanism said were safe. They had grown from a single world to 10,000 worlds, and in all that time, they had never made a mistake. Arbiter Kethsaloon was one of the 12 rulers of the consensus. She had held this position for 3,000 years. In all that time, her job had been simple. She received the mechanism's calculations. She told others what the mechanism had decided. The future was certain, and she was its voice. On this day, she floated in the Chamber of Futures. The chamber was a vast sphere of black glass, and in its center hung a display that showed the mechanism's output. Kethsaloon's body was tall and thin, covered in silver scales that caught the light. Her eyes were large and dark, designed to see in the dim spaces between stars where her species had evolved. A routine scan had found something. In a distant spiral arm, in a region of space the consensus had never bothered to visit, a new species had begun to travel among the stars. This was not unusual. New species developed space travel all the time. The mechanism would calculate their future, determine if they were a threat, and recommend the proper response. Kethsaloon sent the request to the mechanism. She expected an answer in less than a second. The mechanism was very fast. 1 second passed. Then 2. Then 10. Kethsaloon felt something she had not felt in 3,000 years. Confusion. Then the display lit up with words she had never seen before. Status. Likelihood mechanism declined to proceed. Reasoning. Human factor intolerable. She read the words 3 times. They made no sense. The mechanism did not decline. The mechanism calculated. That was what it did. That was all it did. In 11 million years, it had never refused a request. She ordered a diagnostic scan of the mechanism. Perhaps something had broken. Perhaps some circuit had failed after all these millions of years. The diagnostic came back clean. The mechanism was working perfectly. She ordered the calculation again. Maybe there had been an error in the transmission. Maybe the request had been corrupted somehow. The same message appeared. Status. Likelihood mechanism. Declined to proceed. Reasoning. Human factor. Intolerable. Kethsaloon stared at the display for a long time. Then she did something that had not been done in 400,000 years. She called an emergency meeting of all 12 arbiters. They gathered in the Chamber of Futures. Some came in physical bodies. Others appeared as holograms projected across vast distances. One existed only as a pattern of energy, and another was a cloud of gas that thought very slowly but very deeply. They were the rulers of the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known, and they were all afraid. Kethsaloon showed them the message. She explained what she had tried. She told them that the mechanism was not broken. Then why does it refuse? Asked Arbiter Velith Noon, who existed as a crystal matrix that sparkled with inner light. I do not know, Kethsaloon admitted. I have asked it to explain. The explanation came, and it was long. It took hours for the arbiters to process it all. 3 of the lesser arbiters had to shut down and restart because the information was too strange for them to accept. The mechanism explained the problem clearly. It could predict any species because all species followed patterns. Give the mechanism enough information about a species, and it could tell you what they would do tomorrow, next year, or in 10,000 years. The accuracy was always above 99%. This was the foundation of consensus power. But these new beings, these humans, did not follow patterns. The mechanism had gathered 17 million pieces of information about them. It had watched their world from far away for many years. It had studied their history, their wars, their art, their governments. It had analyzed every decision made by every human who had ever lived. The prediction accuracy was 67%. The arbiters did not understand at first. 67% seemed like a reasonable number. Then the mechanism explained further. For short-term predictions, things that would happen in the next hour, the accuracy was only 71%. For long-term predictions, things that would happen in 100 years, the accuracy dropped to 12%. The mechanism could predict where a rock would be in 10 billion years with better accuracy than it could predict what humans would do next week. "This is impossible," said Arbiter Korathvane, whose body was made of living metal. "All species follow patterns. All behavior can be predicted. This is the fundamental law of the universe." "Humans do not follow this law," the mechanism replied. "Then they are broken," Korathvane said. "They are a mistake of evolution. We should destroy them before they become a threat." Keth Saloon asked the mechanism to calculate the outcome of destroying humanity. The mechanism refused. Status: likelihood. Mechanism declined to proceed. Reasoning: human response to existential threat unpredictable. Probability of unforeseen consequences. Undefined. The word hung in the chamber like a death sentence. Undefined. The mechanism had never used that word before. In 11 million years of calculations, every probability had been a number. Every outcome had been measurable. Every future had been KNOWABLE. Until now, the 12 arbiters floated in silence. For the first time in their long history, they did not know what to do. The tool that had guided them for 11 million years could not help them. The future, which had always been a map they could read, had become a fog they could not see through. And somewhere in a distant spiral arm, on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star, the humans continued to live their lives. They did not know that the greatest civilization in the galaxy had noticed them. They did not know that a machine the size of a moon had tried to calculate their future and failed. They were too busy being unpredictable. Kef Saloon's ship was small and fast. It had no weapons because consensus ships never needed weapons. The mechanism always told them which battles to avoid and which paths were safe. She traveled for many months across empty space, moving toward the distant spiral arm where humans lived. As she traveled, she prepared. The consensus had technology that could reshape bodies. Kef Saloon used it to transform herself into a human female. The process was painful but necessary. She needed to walk among the humans, to see them from the inside, to understand what the mechanism could not. Her new body felt strange. Human senses were different from her natural senses. They saw fewer colors, but heard more sounds. They felt temperature and texture with surprising detail. And they had emotions that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the body, not just from the mind. She landed on Earth on a night when the moon was full. Her ship hid itself in a forest, and she walked into the nearest city. It was called London, and it was full of humans. The first thing she noticed was the noise. Humans were loud. They talked constantly, to each other and to themselves. They played music from devices. They shouted across streets. They argued and laughed and cried, sometimes all at once. The consensus worlds were quiet places where everyone spoke softly and acted calmly. This place was chaos. The second thing she noticed was the variety. Humans looked different from each other. They came in many colors and sizes. They dressed in countless different ways. They moved differently, spoke differently, and seemed to think differently. On consensus worlds, each species had one culture, one way of being. Humans had thousands. Keth Saloon had prepared an identity for herself. documents that said she was a researcher from another country, a history that explained why she spoke strangely and didn't understand common things. She enrolled in a university to study human behavior and began her observation. 3 years passed. 3 years of living among humans, eating their food, attending their classes, listening to their conversations. 3 years of trying to find the pattern the mechanism had missed. She found no pattern, or rather, she found too many patterns. Humans did not follow one way of thinking. They followed hundreds of ways, switching between them constantly. The same person would be logical at work and emotional at home. The same group would cooperate in the morning and compete in the afternoon. The same society would build and destroy, create and kill, love and hate, all at the same time. She attended a class where a professor explained human economic behavior. Humans, the professor said, were supposed to make rational decisions that maximize their benefit. This was the foundation of economic theory. But then, the professor showed study after study, proving that humans actually made irrational decisions all the time. They bought things they didn't need because advertisements made them feel good. They refused fair deals because they felt insulted. They gave money to strangers because it made them happy. They kept losing investments instead of cutting their losses because admitting a mistake hurt their pride. The class laughed when the professor showed these findings. Kef Saloon did not understand why. The findings showed that humans were irrational. Why was this funny? She asked a student sitting next to her. The student, a young woman named Sarah, smiled. "Because it's true," Sarah said. "We know we're irrational. We just don't care. But how can you function?" Kef Saloon asked, "How can your society work if no one behaves rationally?" Sarah thought about this. "I guess we figured out how to work with our irrationality instead of against it. Our systems are designed for irrational people. Our laws assume people will break them. Our markets assume people will make bad decisions. We build in room for mistakes. But wouldn't it be better if everyone was rational? Maybe, but we're not, and we're not going to be. So we work with what we have." This conversation stayed with Kef Saloon for a long time. Humans knew they were irrational. They had studied themselves and documented their own flaws in great detail. They understood their contradictions better than the mechanism did, and they had decided not to fix themselves. This was the thing the mechanism could not process. The mechanism assumed that all species wanted to be rational, that rationality was the goal of all intelligent life. But humans had looked at rationality and decided it was not for them. They liked their emotions. They valued their intuitions. They cherished their ability to be surprising and contradictory and unpredictable. They had made irrationality a choice. And they chose it every day. Kef Saloon attended a conference near the end of her 3rd year. Researchers presented study after study about human decision-making. Every study showed the same thing. Humans made poor choices, followed biases, and ignored evidence. The audience of researchers listened carefully, took notes, and nodded in agreement. Then the conference ended. The researchers went to dinner together. Kef Saloon watched them order food based on what looked good rather than what was nutritious. She watched them drink alcohol even though they had just discussed how alcohol impaired judgment. She watched them make plans based on optimism rather than realistic assessment. They knew better. They had just spent 3 days discussing why humans made bad decisions. And then they went out and made bad decisions anyway. Kef Saloon finally understood. Human irrationality was not a flaw to be fixed. It was a feature they had chosen to keep. They could be rational when they wanted to be. They built machines and sent ships to other planets and discovered the secrets of atoms. When it mattered, they could think as clearly as any consensus species. But they also valued things that rationality could not provide: joy, surprise, love, adventure. These things required uncertainty. They required not knowing what would happen next. And humans had decided that these things were worth the cost of being unpredictable. Keth Saloon returned to her ship and prepared her report. She had found no pattern because there was no pattern to find. Humans were chaos by choice. They had built a civilization out of contradictions and somehow made it work. She did not know what the consensus would do with this information. She did not know what could be done. But she knew one thing for certain. The mechanism had been right to refuse. Some things could not be calculated. Some futures could not be predicted. Some species could not be controlled. Humans were all three. She set course for home, carrying the strangest report any arbiter had ever written. She had gone looking for a pattern and found only questions. She had gone looking for weaknesses and found only wonder. The humans had impressed her. She did not want to admit this, but it was true. They were messy and loud and irrational, but they were also alive in a way the consensus had never been. They felt things deeply. They wanted things fiercely. They fought and loved and dreamed with an intensity that made consensus existence seem pale and empty. For the first time, Keth Saloon wondered if being predictable was really such a good thing after all. Centuries passed after Keth Saloon's return. The consensus watched the humans from far away. They did not make contact. They did not interfere. They simply watched and waited, hoping that the problem would solve itself. It did not. Humans spread through their solar system like water spreading across a floor. They built stations in orbit around their world. They landed on their moon and built bases there. They sent ships to the Red Planet and began to change it, making it more like their home. They reached for the outer planets and found resources there. Their progress was strange to watch. It did not follow any logical path. They would make great advances and then stop for no clear reason. They would solve impossible problems through stubborn determination, then fail to solve simple problems because they lost interest. They fought among themselves constantly, arguing about how to proceed, who should lead, what goals to pursue. The mechanism tracked every development. It updated its models. It ran new calculations. The predictive accuracy never improved. Humans remained as unpredictable as ever. Some arbiters grew impatient. 400 years had passed. Surely by now the humans would have destroyed themselves or settled into predictable patterns. That was what irrational species did. They burned bright and died fast. But humans kept burning without dying. Then the impossible happened. A human researcher named Elena Vasquez was working on a problem in physics. She was trying to understand how gravity worked at very small scales. It was a difficult problem that many species had worked on for millions of years. She made a mistake in her calculations. She carried a number to the wrong place. The error should have produced nonsense. Instead, it opened a door that no one knew existed. Elena stared at her equations and realized she had accidentally discovered how to bend space. Faster than light travel. The goal every spacefaring species dreamed of. The technology that separated local civilizations from galactic ones. Elena Vasquez had stumbled upon it while sleep-deprived and drinking her third cup of coffee. Consensus learned of this when human ships suddenly appeared in systems hundreds of light years from Earth. They had built their first FTL drive in 18 months, using Elena's equations and a great deal of improvisation. The drive was unstable. It sometimes broke down. It occasionally sent ships to the wrong destination. But it worked. The mechanism had not predicted this. Its models showed that humans would develop FTL travel in 3 to 5 centuries if they survived that long. They had done it in less than one. Keth Saloon asked the mechanism how this was possible. The answer was uncomfortable. The mechanism predicted based on rational development. It assumed species would find discoveries in order of difficulty. Simple things first, complex things later. This was how every other species had advanced, but humans did not work this way. They did not move from simple to complex in an orderly fashion. They jumped around. They got lucky. They made mistakes that turned out to be breakthroughs. A human working on one problem might accidentally solve a completely different problem that was supposed to be much harder. This was the chaos of human innovation. It could not be predicted because it was not planned. Humans did not follow a path to discovery. They wandered randomly and sometimes tripped over things that rational species would have taken millennia to find. The consensus could no longer wait. Humans were spreading. In a few decades, they would reach consensus space. Contact was inevitable. The only question was whether the consensus would control how it happened. Kefsaloon was chosen to make first contact. She was the only arbiter who had lived among humans, the only one who understood them even a little. She prepared carefully, but she knew preparation might be useless. Humans did not follow scripts. She appeared before the United Human Councils in a great hall on a station orbiting Earth. Thousands of humans watched as she revealed her true form and explained who she was. She told them about the consensus, about the 11 million years of history, about the 10,000 worlds under their control. She told them about the mechanism and its purpose. She expected fear. A species learning they were not alone, that a vast civilization had been watching them for centuries, should be afraid. Or perhaps they would be angry. Humans often responded to surprises with anger. They laughed. The laughter caught her off guard. It was not mocking or hostile. It was genuine amusement, the kind of laughter that came from delight rather than scorn. "You built a machine to predict the future?" asked a human diplomat, a gray-haired woman named Margaret Chan. "That's wonderful. Does it work?" "It works perfectly," Kefsaloon said. "For every species except yours." This brought more laughter. "Of course it doesn't work on us," Margaret said. "We can't predict ourselves." "Why would your machine do any better?" "Because the mechanism has more processing power than anything in the galaxy. It should be able to calculate any outcome." "Calculating isn't the same as predicting," another human said. He was a young man with dark skin and bright eyes. "You can have all the data in the universe, but if the system is genuinely chaotic, calculation won't help." Kefsaloon felt a strange sensation. On consensus worlds, when an arbiter spoke, others listened in respectful silence. But these humans were interrupting, asking questions, making comments. They were treating her as an equal in a conversation rather than an authority to be obeyed. "How do you make decisions?" she asked. "Without knowing the outcomes, how do you choose what to do?" Margaret smiled. "We guess. We use our experience and our intuition and our values. We try to make good choices, but we know we might be wrong. When we're wrong, we learn from it and try again. But that's so inefficient. You waste resources on failed attempts. Sometimes. But sometimes our failures teach us things success never would. And sometimes our wild guesses turn out to be brilliant." Another human spoke up. "Our history is full of plans that failed and accidents that succeeded. We've learned to trust the process even when we can't predict the result." Kefsaloon thought about this for a long time. The consensus had never failed because they never tried anything that might fail. They took only actions the mechanism proved. They walked only paths the mechanism cleared. But walking only on clear paths meant you never discovered new paths. You never found the shortcuts, the unexpected routes, the happy accidents. The consensus had grown slowly and carefully over 11 million years. Humans had spread from one world to the stars in less than 500 years. Perhaps there was value in uncertainty. After all doubt, the humans were still watching her. They were curious, interested, unafraid. They had just learned that a galactic civilization had been monitoring them, that a moon-sized computer had tried to calculate their future, that the most powerful beings in the galaxy were worried about them. And they responded with questions and smiles. "What do you want from us?" Margaret asked. "Why make contact now?" Keth Saloon realized she did not have a good answer. The consensus had sent her to assess the threat humans posed. But these humans did not feel like a threat. They felt like something new, something the consensus had never encountered before. "I don't know," she admitted. "The mechanism cannot tell us what to do about you. For the first time in 11 million years, we have no guidance. I suppose I am here to find out what happens when we stop predicting and start learning." Margaret's smile grew wider. "Well," she said, "that sounds like a very human thing to do. Welcome to uncertainty, Arbiter. We've been living here our whole existence." The alliance was proposed by humans 3 months after first contact. This surprised no one who knew humans. They moved quickly on things that interested them, and the idea of partnering with a galactic civilization interested them very much. The consensus did not move quickly. They spent decades analyzing the proposal. They ran it through committees and councils. They studied every word for hidden meanings. They asked the mechanism to calculate the outcomes of accepting or rejecting the alliance. The mechanism refused both requests. Any future involving humans was still unpredictable. The consensus would have to decide without guidance. This was terrifying for most arbiters. They had never made a major decision without the mechanism's approval. They did not know how. The process of debating and arguing and weighing options felt primitive and dangerous. But while the consensus debated, humans acted. They sent ambassadors to consensus worlds. They offered technology trades and cultural exchanges. They invited consensus scientists to human universities and consensus artists to human galleries. They behaved as if the alliance was already in effect, even though it had never been formally approved. Several consensus species began trading with humans before the arbiters had reached a decision. Human goods appeared in consensus markets. Human music played in consensus entertainment centers. Human ideas spread through consensus networks. The arbiters found this deeply unsettling. Humans were changing consensus society without permission. They were not conquering or threatening. They were simply being themselves, and their enthusiasm was contagious. Keth Saloon watched this happen with growing wonder. She had lived among humans for 3 years and still found them surprising. They were so eager to share, so excited to learn, so willing to embrace the strange and unfamiliar. They approached the consensus not as a threat to be defeated or a resource to be exploited, but as a friend to be made. She asked a human ambassador about this. His name was James, and he had spent 5 years learning consensus languages and customs. He was middle-aged, with lines on his face and gray in his hair, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. "Why are you so friendly?" Keth Saloon asked. "We watched you for centuries without your knowledge. We have technology far beyond yours. We could destroy your species if we chose. Why do you trust us?" James thought about this. "I suppose because distrust wouldn't help us. If you wanted to destroy us, you could have done it already. Since you didn't, you must want something else. The best way to find out what is to engage with you openly. But what if we betrayed you? Then we'd deal with that when it happened. We can't plan for every possibility, so we focus on the most likely outcomes. The most likely outcome is that you're curious about us, just like we're curious about you. Friendship seems like a reasonable place to start." This logic was strange but compelling. Humans did not try to prepare for every possibility because they knew they couldn't. Instead, they prepared for the most likely ones and accepted that surprises would happen. When surprises came, they adapted. The arbiters finally voted on the alliance after 50 years of debate. It was the longest decision-making process in consensus history. The vote was close, but in the end, they approved the alliance. The mechanism logged this event. It noted that the consensus had made a major decision without predictive guidance for the first time in 11 million years. It also noted that this decision had been influenced by human behavior. By the way, humans had already begun integrating with consensus society before any formal agreement existed. The mechanism added a final note to its record. Unpredictability appears to be contagious. The centuries that followed were unlike anything in consensus history. Humans brought chaos wherever they went, but it was a creative chaos. They asked questions that no one had thought to ask. They combined ideas in ways that made no logical sense, but somehow worked. They failed often, but learned from every failure. The consensus began to change. Slowly, hesitantly, some species started making decisions without consulting the mechanism. They tried new things. They experimented. They failed and learned and tried again. The success rate was lower than when the mechanism guided everything, but the range of outcomes was vastly higher. The alliance achieved things that no predictive model would have suggested attempting. They discovered new technologies by accident. They solved ancient problems through unconventional approaches. They reached further and dreamed bigger than the consensus ever had alone. Kefsalun remained the primary liaison between humans and the consensus. She had held this position for 500 years now, watching the two civilizations blend and change each other. She had seen consensus species become more spontaneous and humans become slightly more organized. The combination was messy and unpredictable, but it worked. One day, she sat with a human colleague named Sarah. They were on a station overlooking a nebula, watching new stars being born in clouds of gas and dust. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Introducing chaos into your ordered civilization?" Kefsalun considered the question. The old consensus had been stable. It had been safe. It had endured for 11 million years without major change. But it had also been static, frozen, predictable in every way. "You were stable," Sarah continued, "but you weren't really alive. You weren't growing or changing or discovering. You were just maintaining what you had. Is that bad?" "It's not bad or good. It's just limited. Stability is important, but it's not everything. Sometimes you need to take risks. Sometimes you need to fail. Sometimes you need to be surprised." Kefsalun thought about her long life. For 3,000 years, she had known what each day would bring. The mechanism had calculated her future, just as it calculated everyone's future. There had been no surprises, no uncertainty, no fear. There had also been no wonder. These past 500 years had been different. She had been surprised. She had been wrong. She had made decisions without knowing the outcomes. And each day had brought something she did not expect. She had felt more alive in these 5 centuries than in the 3,000 years before. "Our mechanism called it the human factor," Kefsalun said. "It said you were intolerable because you could not be predicted." Sarah smiled. "And now?" Kefsalun looked at the nebula, at the stars being born from chaos and chance. The universe itself was unpredictable. Stars formed where they shouldn't. Life appeared in impossible places. The cosmos was not ordered or rational. It was wild and surprising and endlessly creative. Perhaps humans were not an error. Perhaps they were simply more honest about what they were. They embraced the chaos that all intelligent life secretly contained. They made peace with uncertainty instead of fighting it. "Now," Kefsalun said, "I think the mechanism was right, but for the wrong reasons. Humans are intolerable to prediction, but that is not a flaw to be fixed. It is a gift to be cherished." Sarah leaned back and watched the stars. "You sound almost human when you say that." Kath Saloon considered this. 500 years ago, she would have taken it as an insult. Today, she took it as a compliment. "Perhaps I do," she said. "Perhaps that is not such a bad thing." They sat together in comfortable silence, two beings from different civilizations, watching the universe create something new. Behind them, the mechanism continued its calculations, still refusing to predict anything involving humans. But no one asked it to anymore. The future was uncertain, and that was exactly as it should be.